Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources, strip away the noise, and get straight to the critical thinking that's hiding just underneath the headlines. Our mission today is a very specific one. We aren't interested in the predictable heat of party politics, that us versus them stuff you hear every day. Instead, we're looking at the quieter bit underneath it all, the foundational assumptions that really determine how laws get made and maybe more importantly, what happens when they actually hit the real world. It's incredibly easy to notice when a politician or, say, a media commentator is making a very emotive, values-driven argument for a law against this or a ban on that. You can feel the moral energy behind it. It usually comes from a genuine place, a well-meaning place. But, okay, let's unpack this a little. Why do we so rarely ask the second-order questions? We seem to stop once the moral message has been sent. We almost never ask, how is this actually going to be enforced consistently across millions of people who have every incentive to find a workaround?
That is the exact tension we need to zero in on for you today. I mean, the central question our sources are really getting at is this. What happens when moral certainty is asked to do the job that evidence and practicality normally do? Because the moment a moral idea gets written into law and enacted, it fundamentally changes. It stops being just a guiding principle and it immediately becomes a complex interacting system. And systems, whether we're talking about a healthcare network or a legal framework, they have inevitable, often really messy consequences. And that's regardless of the lofty principles that birthed them. They're subject to human nature, to economic pressure, to, physics. But this is crucial. We are not launching an attack on morality here. Not at all. Most people want laws to reflect a clear sense of right and wrong. Of course they do. The problem, the real issue, arises when that powerful moral impulse just overrides the absolute necessity for critical investigation and rigorous practical planning.
And it gets framed so often as if morality and evidence are these like natural enemies, right? Always battling for the soul of a policy. But the sources make a really strong case that they often point to the exact same destination. I mean, morality is fundamentally concerned with outcomes, less harm, safer communities, dignity, flourishing lives. And evidence-based policy, when it's done right, is just the most reliable map to delivering those exact same things. They're usually aligned.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The problem isn't when morality and evidence happen to coincide. It's when we assume they must coincide and stop checking.
Mm-hmm.
That moment, that decision to stop checking, it's often politically or emotionally motivated, but it creates this cascade of systemic consequences. Consequences that are often incredibly costly and chaotic down the line. Just think about the moment a new rule is established solely based on its perceived virtue. At that point, that morally driven idea essentially becomes immune to critical feedback. So if uncomfortable data shows up, data saying, hey, this isn't working the way you hoped, or it's actually just shifting the problem over here, that data gets brushed aside. It gets brushed aside because it conflicts with the moral righteousness of the original idea.
And if you dig deeper into why that happens, it's because pointing out those messy, unintended consequences starts to feel like disloyalty.
Right.
Disloyalty to the core value that the policy is supposed to represent. If the policy is good and right, then anyone saying it's having a negative effect must, by extension, be against that underlying moral goal.
Precisely. The policy stops functioning as a guide that's informed by reality. Instead, it becomes a shield designed to protect a comforting moral viewpoint from reality. We see this play out constantly.
So if the policy has shifted from being a guide to being a shield, is the failure really one of leadership, or is it more of a systemic failure where data just isn't welcome anymore? The sources characterize this state brilliantly. They suggest it's not a failure of your core values. It's fundamentally a failure of curiosity, a refusal to ask that one single crucial question, what actually happens next? And critically, why is that failure of curiosity so tempting?
It's tempting because moral certainty offers immediate gratification. It's clean. It gives you an instant sense of resolution. We've drawn the line, we've sent the message, and we feel good about it. Evidence, on the other hand, offers complexity. It offers trade-offs. It takes time, it requires resources, and it often delivers uncomfortable answers. It tells you what you can't have, even if you really wish you could. So it's much easier to feel good now and, deal with the mess later.
And that failure of curiosity is then immediately compounded by what the sources are calling the scaling problem. Policymaking is so often done by a pretty small group of decision makers, and they tend to talk about the public as if it were one single coherent mind that will interpret and react to the law exactly as they intended.
But the public is millions of individual people, and each one is operating under totally different pressures, different incentives, fears, habits, different amounts of room to maneuver. Even if people broadly agree with the spirit of a policy, they just don't experience it the same way. The tendency is for the decision makers to just assume everyone else will see the moral clarity of the law just as clearly as they do.
That sounds like a fundamental misdiagnosis of human nature at scale.
It is. And this is where that specific analogy from the source material is so helpful. Think about writing an email. If you write an email to one person, you choose your words carefully, the intent feels perfectly clear, unambiguous. Now, send the exact same words to a whole organization, thousands of people. Suddenly, the meaning just fragments completely.
Oh, you know exactly what happens. Half the people interpret it differently. Someone immediately spots a loophole you never intended. Someone else just ignores it because they're busy. And there's always one person who does the exact opposite of what you meant, believing they understood the spirit of the rule better than the letter.
Exactly. And the core insight for you here is that policy works the same way. What feels obvious or morally clear to a small, homogeneous group of policymakers just doesn't translate neatly once it hits millions of different lives and pre-existing systems. And that's because meaning doesn't scale cleanly. The sheer complexity of human behavior and incentives, it simply refuses to fit into a tidy moral box built by a committee.
And when you start looking across different policy areas, it doesn't matter if we're talking about environmental rules, social services, public health, you see this recurring, almost monotonous pattern. It keeps appearing. We see strong moral language, clear and good intent, followed by extremely awkward, messy, and expensive outcomes.
And that awkwardness, it follows a predictable script. The behavior you wanted to stop doesn't disappear just because a law said it should. It just shifts laterally or it goes underground. The harm shows up somewhere else in a new, unmanaged context.
And crucially, enforcement turns out to be patchy or unbelievably expensive. It requires massive resources just to maintain that moral boundary. But the most insidious part is that the costs always seem to land on a completely different part of the system, often on individuals or agencies or budgets that weren't even in the room when the decision was made.
And we need to contrast the types of questions that each approach encourages to really understand why this pattern persists.
Hmm.
So virtue-led thinking, it starts with emotionally satisfying questions. They're questions designed to make the policymakers feel decisive and good. Questions like, what behavior do we want to discourage? Or, what line do we want to draw in the sand? What moral message does this law send to society?
Those sound like questions designed to end the discussion, not start the execution.
They absolutely are. But evidence-led thinking, it quietly asks a different set of questions. The ones that determine whether a policy actually works in the difficult, gritty, real world. They ask, given the incentives, what will people actually do next? What workarounds or black markets will appear to fill the demand? Which existing system? Is it the courts, the hospitals, the schools? Which one picks up the mess created by this new restriction? Right. And finally, who ends up paying for the long-term, predictable behavioral shifts?
Yeah, those evidence-led questions are definitely not glamorous. They don't generate inspiring press releases or feel particularly decisive, do they? But they are the questions that make the difference. The difference between a policy that actually achieves its aims and one that instead quietly drains money, trust, and capacity for years, all while keeping up this facade of moral effectiveness.
And this leads us to the critical distinction between defending a policy and evaluating it. Once a policy is framed and passed based on its moral correctness, it often stops being an object for evaluation. It becomes an object for defense. It's gained political capital that has to be protected.
That defensive pattern is incredibly familiar, isn't it? And it's self-reinforcing. It's a classic logical trap. If the policy works, well, that's proof that the moral action was necessary and correct. But if the data shows it isn't working, that isn't seen as evidence of failure. No, it's reframed as proof that the law needs to be tougher, or that the moral line wasn't drawn hard enough. The problem is never the premise. The problem is always just insufficient resolve.
This really helps explain why evidence often feels cold or morally unsatisfying.
Mm.
I mean, evidence-based policy has a bit of a PR problem because it's willing to state uncomfortable, pragmatic truths that a lot of people wish weren't true. It states that trade-offs are unavoidable. It recognizes that some persistent human behaviors, they just don't disappear when you make them illegal. They just become harder and more dangerous to track.
So if virtue is providing the comforting story, evidence is providing the difficult reality. Evidence isn't cold, it's just honest about how humans behave at scale and how complex systems actually operate.
Exactly. And large, slow-moving systems like national infrastructure, court schedules, public health care, they do not respond well to wishful thinking. And that honesty is what makes evidence-led policy so unpopular with groups who prioritize the comforting story of moral purity over the difficult reality of harm reduction.
And that refusal to ask the practical questions that ultimately leads directly to what the source calls the bill nobody likes talking about.
Hmm.
When a morally driven policy goes wrong, the financial and human costs, they don't appear in the committee room where the original discussion happened. They land far away.
They do. And they're usually passed down to systems that were designed to handle complex human problems, but not necessarily this specific new flood of behavior.
And where exactly does that pressure show up later? The source material is very clear about this. It's in courts that are suddenly clogged, in prisons that are unnecessarily overcrowded, in A&E departments dealing with behavioral crises, in mental health services that are now strained past capacity, in schools, and critically, in the local authority budgets that have to mop up the whole operational mess.
And by the time those system-wide costs become visible and overwhelming, the original policy decision, the one that caused all the pressure, is long past. It's often forgotten. So the public narrative shifts. We are then told, almost universally, that these systems are just chronically under pressure or simply underfunded. And that obscures the fact that this specific surge in pressure was a direct, predictable, and measurable consequence of an earlier, morally satisfying policy decision. A decision that just refused to ask the practical, evidence-led questions.
So what does this all mean for you, the person trying to understand how the world works? We have to change the question we ask at the beginning of any policy debate. We have to start asking, how much does enforcing our moral comfort actually cost the systems that keep society running?
To confirm this cross-cutting pattern, the sources specifically list policy areas that, though they seem disconnected, they often break in remarkably similar ways.
Mhm.
These are high-stakes, values-laden areas. Things like drugs policy, criminal punishment, sex work regulation, migration law, and abortion law. And again, we're not here to debate the merits of these specific issues, not at all. The point is just to note that across this diverse list, the pattern holds. The pattern of high moral intent leading to systemic chaos because of the failure of curiosity, it's constant. It holds true regardless of the subject.
And that recognition allows us to arrive at the key reframing concept. And this is really worth holding on to as you look at future policy announcements. Law doesn't decide whether behaviors exist. Human behavior, often messy and imperfect, it exists regardless of the rule. What the law actually decides is whether dealing with those existing behaviors is handled in a way that is cheap and boring or expensive and chaotic.
That contrast is vital. A cheap and boring system manages behavior without any fanfare. It uses established infrastructure and has low operational friction. An expensive and chaotic system, on the other hand, is one that requires constant funding, constant defense, and it generates endless unintended consequences. And it drains the capacity of all the other systems around it.
And once you look at policy through that lens, the lens of operational cost versus moral satisfaction, you start to realize something. You realize that many familiar arguments that sound like these fundamental disagreements about values are actually, well, they're disagreements about whether we prefer a comforting story that makes us feel good instantly or a workable system that actually minimizes measurable harm and friction.
And to wrap this up, we have to guard against one very expensive mistake that contributes massively to this chaos. And that's confusing behaviors that are new with behaviors that are simply more visible. A lot of human behaviors that trigger a modern moral panic and demand a new, expensive law. They aren't new at all. They're just easier to see now thanks to the internet or changes in surveillance tech.
And confusing that sudden visibility for novelty often leads policymakers to destroy or ignore established systems that were quietly, cheaply, and boringly managing the behavior all along. So they create expensive, complicated new rules for things that could have just been handled by the plumbing that already existed. That brings us to the end of our dive into the source material for today. The central insight we've extracted is this. The moment morality stops guiding policy and starts shielding it from the difficult reality of human behavior at scale, that is the precise moment the hidden costs begin to quietly accumulate in the most unexpected corners of society. And those costs inevitably weaken the very systems we all rely on every single day.
So if the ultimate goal of policy is to manage human systems efficiently and, reduce harm at scale, here's a provocative thought for you to explore on your own. Think about those older, often invisible, supposedly boring systems in your own community regulatory codes, zoning laws, public health protocols, the things that currently deal with common human behavior cheaply and without any fanfare. Which of those quiet, dull, successful systems are actually far more robust and effective than the latest expensive, morally satisfying rules that require constant political defense? We often forget to measure success not by the emotional message sent, but by the absence of predictable downstream chaos.
Something important to mull over as you encounter the news this week. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.